Whether you realize it or not, a lot of the job of being a manager is stakeholder management. In this video, I'm going to explain what that really means and how to get better at it. Hey, how's it going? This is Scruffy Leadership, a YouTube channel about management and leadership aimed particularly at software engineers. My name's Ben, and I've been a leader and a manager in the tech industry for over 25 years. Okay, so first, what is a stakeholder? No, it's not them, although I guess they're holding stakes. A stakeholder is basically anyone that has an interest in the work you or your team are doing. So, for example, in a typical software project, stakeholders might include the engineers working on the project, including you, the product manager, project manager, engineers in other teams whose work is affected by your project, their bosses, your boss, the manager of the engineer you've borrowed to plug a temporary gap, the company's CEO, CFO, CTO, the marketing team for your company, and depending on the nature of the project and the nature of your organization, it can also include lawyers, privacy specialists, writers, designers, a whole range of other people. And what exactly does it mean for those people to be stakeholders? It means that they care, even just a little bit, about your project. They care about its success, or they care about the impact it has on them and their world. And that might be because their input is needed, or it might be because your project has some effect on them beyond the life of the project. For example, maybe in building a new feature, you have to make a change to a commonly used software library. Everyone else that uses that library is now a stakeholder. So stakeholders can be internal to your company, but you'll also sometimes have external stakeholders, people outside the company that care about what you're working on. This could be users of your software, suppliers, external marketing and legal folks, or even members of the press or competitor organizations. Now, they might not know that they're your stakeholders, but you can still consider them to be a stakeholder if your work is going to affect them in the future. Okay, this is all a bit much, isn't it? Too many people, and that can often be what it feels like, that you have too many stakeholders. And as you get more senior, you'll likely have more and more stakeholders, and those stakeholders will expect more and more of you. And that goes with the territory. So learning to manage stakeholders is a really important skill, and one that you'll likely be working on for the rest of your career as a manager or a leader. So what does stakeholder management look like? Well, step one is to identify who your stakeholders are. And it's a good idea to be really thorough about this. List all of them. And I'd suggest literally writing them down and writing down what relationship each of them has with the project. And if you know it, write down what they want from the project or why they want it to succeed. So for each stakeholder, you might write their name, their title, and their relationship to the project, or what they want from the project. We might start with yourself. You're a software engineering eng lead, and you want it to succeed so that your team can get the recognition they deserve. Perhaps you note down the CEO, Bob, who wants the project to succeed so he can impress his shareholders, and so on. And notice that I have suggested you include yourself. You're a stakeholder of the project, even if you're not a stakeholder of yourself. And it's good to be explicit about what you want out of the project. But wait a minute, you know who your manager is, and you probably know her well enough to ask her what she wants from the project. But how are you supposed to know what the CEO or other stakeholders want from the project? Well, in some cases, the answer is to ask. So you might chat with Jane and ask her, what are your thoughts about this project? What do you want us to achieve? What do you want not to happen? What are you worried about? Maybe you can't do that with the CEO because you don't get access to the CEO, in which case you either have to start with your best guess, or if the project is a really significant one, maybe get someone else to find out for you. The key thing is you shouldn't have an empty box. There should be no stakeholders for whom you have just no idea what they might want from your project. If you make a guess and it turns out to be wrong, you can always update it later. So once you've got your list, the next step is to prioritize your stakeholders. You can't interact with every single stakeholder every single day. So you're going to decide which are the most important stakeholders and also what kind of stakeholders they are. There's lots of ways to do this, lots of ways to put stakeholders in buckets. One method which you could use is the RACI framework, which you might have come across. So this is a way to label who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed. And you can use this about a project as a whole, or you can use it about individual aspects of a project, such as privacy, for example. So you might extend your table to label each row as one of R, A, C, or I, like this. And you might have stakeholders in your list that aren't R, A, C, or I. So they're not responsible, they're not accountable, they don't need to be consulted, and they don't need to be informed, but they're still stakeholders. That's okay. It doesn't mean they're not a stakeholder necessarily, but it might mean they're not a stakeholder. It can also just mean they're a lower priority stakeholder, someone you can pay a bit less attention to. That's okay. If you treat everyone as being high priority, that's kind of the same as treating no one as high priority. And notice this is a little different from determining roles and responsibilities on the project. That's something else you need to do, but I'm not covering that in this video. And the next step, which might be a job for you, or it might fall to the project manager or maybe the product manager, is to decide on processes for regular communication and exceptional communication with your stakeholders. So you might put in place a regular weekly update for everyone internal to the organization that needs to be informed, for example. All right, this is where it starts to get interesting. So as I've described it so far, stakeholder management is pretty straightforward, right? In reality, it's usually not. And that's because many of those stakeholders will have things they want, positive outcomes for the project, and things they want to avoid. And this might involve how much credit they get for the project's success, or it might be as basic as the overall goals of the project. And if your stakeholders don't all agree on those things, that's where it can get tricky. So that means that one of the most important skills in stakeholder management is dealing with misalignment. And all I mean by misalignment is when two stakeholders don't agree about the goals of the project or some other significant aspect of the project. So, for example, perhaps the CTO thinks the most important thing is to avoid building technical debt by focusing on testing and code quality, while the CEO thinks the most important thing is to get the product out on time. Now, in an ideal world, the CTO and the CEO would sort that out between themselves before the project starts, and you wouldn't even need to know there'd ever been a misalignment. Unfortunately, it often doesn't happen that way, and you, as a leader, end up with these conflicting demands being placed on you by different stakeholders. Now, in some cases, the answer is for you to make a prioritization decision. So, for example, if the marketing team wants you to add an extra feature and your boss is saying the deadline can't be moved, you can make a choice and you can explain your decision to both stakeholders. So maybe you'd say to the head of marketing that although you agree the feature they're asking for would be useful, you don't think its absence would render the launch unsuccessful, and so you propose to launch without it. If they disagree, you can explain you'd be happy to reprioritize things to add the feature in, but you'll need to discuss with them and with your boss what other features to deprioritize, since the timescales are fixed. In other cases, you won't feel like you can do that. Like in the example I mentioned earlier where the CEO and the CTO don't agree. Maybe the CTO is in your management line, so perhaps you're closer to them than you are to the CEO, in which case you can explain to the CTO that you're getting conflicting requirements and you need them to go and discuss it with the CEO and let you know the outcome. Meanwhile, you can explain you're going to proceed on the basis of assuming whatever you're going to assume, perhaps hitting the deadline is the most important factor is going to be your assumption. So a key aspect in all stakeholder management is communication. If you have disagreeing stakeholders, the answer is always going to take the form of communication with at least one of them and not stopping that communication until you're satisfied with the outcome. And even if your stakeholders don't disagree, even if they're aligned, over-communicating is almost always a good way to keep stakeholders feeling in the loop. It's easier to cut down on communication if you get feedback that you're communicating too much than it is to go the other way. And typically that's because if you get feedback that you're not communicating enough, that's because something's already gone wrong as a result of your lack of communication. So stakeholder management is really relationship management. It's about managing the relationships you have with the people that matter for your particular project. And that involves, for each stakeholder, being aware of what they want from the project, being aware of what they bring to the project, being aware of what conflicts there might be between them and other stakeholders, and then communicating with them effectively to keep them informed, to hear their thoughts, and to resolve conflicts. Now, it won't always go smoothly. Stakeholders will not always be well behaved. I don't want to suggest you should go into paranoid mode, but it's a good idea to be aware of where the risks are. If you resolve a conflict between stakeholders, maybe send an email to both of them, perhaps CCing a few other people like your boss, confirming the decision that's been made. In some cases, you're going to need to make some tough calls, conflicts that aren't going to resolve themselves and that you need to resolve by making a decision, but a decision for which you don't have all the information. For my guidance on how to make decisions with only 5% of the information, check out the video that's on the screen now. And if you have thoughts or questions about the subject of this video, why not let me know about them in the comments below? And the same goes if you have any ideas for subjects you'd like to see me cover in future videos. Bye. See you soon.